So I'm Diana. My name is Diana. I'm the BERDO Review Board manager. The BERDO Review Board does not currently have an appointed chair, so I will lead us in a vote for acting chair. Does anyone want to make a nomination for acting chair?
I would like to nominate Kai Palmer Dunning as acting chair for this meeting.
Second.
Awesome, great, beautiful. In that case, I will now lead us in a vote. How do you vote for the motion to nominate board member Palmer Dunning to serve as acting chair? I will start with you, board member Ellis.
Aye.
Board member Jacobs. I think you're muted if you. Oh, aye. Okay, great. Board member Jacob. Sorry, Lattimore.
Aye.
Board member Counselor Lara. I don't believe she's with us right now. Board member O'Malley.
Aye.
And board member Palmer Dunning.
Aye.
Great. I will now hand over the meeting to acting chair Palmer Dunning.
Great, thanks, Diana, and welcome everybody to our August 21st BERDO Review Board public meeting. Good afternoon. I'm calling this this public hearing to order at 4:34 in accordance with the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance regulations adopted pursuant to the Buildings Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, Boston City Code Ordinance Section 7/2.2. The BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 on August 21st to review the following topics in regards to the reduction of greenhouse gases from building emissions production and consumption, so as to promote the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online. To ensure public access to the deliberations of the BERDO Review Board, the public may access this call through phone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment on regulations discussions. To do so, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. And if you are calling in or cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. So for the record, my name is Kai Palmer Dunning. I'll be acting chair of the board, and I will now conduct a roll call of board members. Board members, please say your name in the order they appear on the slide. So I believe the board member Boyd will be joining us shortly. Okay.
Stephen Ellis.
It looks like board member Jacobs, her mic isn't working, but board member Jacobs is in attendance. Board member Lattimore.
Gail Lattimore.
Next is Councilor Laura on the call yet?
I don't believe she's with us yet.
Great. Okay, moving on. Board member O'Malley.
Matt O'Malley.
Okay. And finally, again, my name is Kai Palmer Dunning. Next, we'll have City of Boston staff members introduce themselves.
Diana Vasquez with the Environment Department.
Claudia Diaz Martinez, Environment Department.
Aladdin Joroff, Environment Department.
Aiden Callan, Environment Department.
Great. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So here's the agenda for today's meeting. We're going to start with approval of meeting minutes, then review activities that have been completed in phase 3 of regulation development thus far. Then will be the Environment Department will summarize comments received during the first formal comment period on building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. They will also present regulation revisions that are a result of those comments, and the department will also present a straw proposal on hardship compliance and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, and present updates on BERDO's reporting implementation and cover any additional administrative updates, and then we'll hopefully adjourn on time. So first, on the agenda is to approve the previous meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All right, I have a second.
I seconded it.
Great, thanks. The motion to approve the minutes, so we'll do a roll call. Say aye if you're in favor, and abstain if you were in attendance, and nay if you don't approve. So we'll do a roll call, starting with board member Boyd. Has she joined us?
I don't believe so, not yet.
Board member Ellis,
Unfortunately, I have to say nay, and it's for 3 reasons. I'll just quickly note, my name is missing from the attendance, the roll call, and then I have a question about the half hour of notes that is missing. So I'm going to have to say nay.
great. Board member Ellis, board member Jacobs. Just indicate in the chat if your mic is still working. All right, well, board member Jacobs, do you mind indicating in the chat if you approve the meeting minutes? Okay, well, please, when you are able to do so, please indicate if you approve the meeting minutes. Moving on to
Acting Chair Palmer Dunning. Do we want to pause voting and discuss amendments to the minutes before, if that would help with the voting?
sure, yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
I hear, like, Stephen, did you have a question?
The quick question was, I noticed that there was a half hour worth of notes that I'm wondering if it was intentionally left out between give me a second, I saw it earlier. Between 5:36 and 6:06, and it may just intentionally be because we were having a conversation, but that was the part that I had noticed missing from the minutes, as well as I mentioned earlier, my name. So that's all.
Yeah, sorry if I missed your name. That was an accident, my bad. So I can definitely add in your attendance to the last meeting. And yes, you're correct. So during the last meeting, we had a conversation kind of discussing draft regulations of the building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. I sort of summarized that section. If board members would like a more detailed transcription of that conversation, I'm happy to add that to the minutes as well.
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense. How do other board members feel?
Yes, I think that would make the most sense as well.
Okay. Should we suspend voting on the minutes until they've been updated?
Yes, I can. Yes, I'll update the minutes and then we can vote on the following meeting. And I can share the updated minutes prior to the next meeting, so folks can vote on that as well.
And before we move on to the next agenda item, I just want to see if board member Jacobs is on the call. I don't see her on the attendance list and the participants list. She might have had to drop off due to audio issues.
Oh, good flag. I don't see her in the attendance currently.
Okay.
In that case, we will have to wait for board member Jacobs to join us again, because now we no longer have quorum. So I'm hoping she's going to rejoin the call. Let's give her a minute. I'm going to message her very quickly.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody's been having a wonderful Monday. It's been nice weather.
Yeah, I'm an hour behind in Chicago, but so it's a little And I got a little off kilter thinking that we were not meeting this time, probably because I was hoping we weren't because I was traveling, but that wasn't the case. But otherwise, it's good. Thank you.
I have a friend in Chicago right now. I hear the weather's really nice.
Yeah, it's pretty temperate right now. It was really hot yesterday, though.
Board member Jacobs has now rejoined the meeting.
Okay.
Great. Okay. All right, moving on to it's just for to catch Boardman Jacobs up. So we suspended voting on the meeting minutes because there were a couple of discrepancies. So we'll be re-voting on this last meeting's meeting minutes at the following review board meeting. All right, moving on to the next agenda item. Next will be next on the agenda is an update and discussion on the BERDO Phase 3 regulation development. So I'll pass it to the Environment Department staff.
Sorry, trying to unmute. So I can kick us off. I'm sure folks may be familiar with our topics, but we're now currently what we're calling Phase 3 of regulations development. And these are the topics that we're hoping to address in Phase 3. So building portfolios, individual compliance schedules, hardship compliance plans, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, fines and enforcement, and compliance with emission standards. So Phase 3 so far, we kicked off Phase 3 with a listing session in March. We've had 2 public technical working sessions so far on building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, both in March and April. We hold monthly community advisory group meetings and optional office hours. So our next meeting will be office hours scheduled this week. We've had focus groups for hardship compliance plans with the following stakeholders: affordable housing, Longwood hospitals, healthcare, historic preservation, and the Green Ribbon Commission's Cultural Institutions Working Group. We are currently working with a technical consultant to support the development of regulations regarding technical hardship compliance plans. And of course, we're hoping to have additional community meetings, technical working sessions, and potentially focus groups for the summer. And speaking of that, so we actually have 2 working sessions coming up this week. Tomorrow we have one from 1 to 2:30 on hardship compliance plans. It is open to the public, but we're hoping for it to be a technical kind of conversation. And this Wednesday we have a public working session on the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund for 1 to 2:30, and anyone can register for those. And thank you, Claudia. I see you linked the registration in the chat. So yes, so those are happening both this week, Tuesday and Wednesday. And I wanted to do a brief kind of report back. So last Wednesday, the BERDO team presented revised regulation language on the building portfolios and individual compliance schedules to the Air Pollution Control Commission. The commission voted to open a second comment period, this time for 28 days. So this means that this comment period, which opened this past Friday, will close on September 15th at 12 p.m. The BERDO team also presented straw proposals to the commission regarding hardship compliance plans and the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. And the BERDO team opened an informal comment period this past Friday as well, and it will close on the same day, so Friday, September 15 at 12 o'clock p.m. So we're currently have 2 sort of comment periods happening, but we're encouraging folks to give us feedback in one. And now I'll hand it to Claudia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start with summarizing the feedback that we got for the first formal public comment period that the Air Pollution Control Commission held for building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, this first formal public comment period closed on Friday, August 11 at 12 p.m. And we received feedback from the following individuals, institutions, and organizations. We received letters from A Better City, Alternatives for Community and Environment, the Conference of Boston Teaching Hospitals, the Green Ribbon Commission Higher Education Working Group, Longwood Medical Energy Collaborative, Longwood Collective, Mass General Brigham, and 2 individuals, Keith Supko and Michael Savage. Next slide, please. Now I'm gonna summarize the main themes that we got from these comment letters for both building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. Most of the comments were related to clarifications or minor revisions in language. So for both topics, we got comment letters seeking more clarity on the process to appeal review board decisions, seeking more clarity on whether standard conditions are required or optional for all building portfolios and individual compliance schedules that are approved by the review board, a request for the City of Boston to make draft standard forms available for review and public comment. This refers to standard forms to apply for building portfolios and ICS, as well as seeking more clarity on the review board's options to terminate versus amend an approved building portfolio or ICS. Next slide, please. For building portfolios specifically, we also had several comments seeking more clarity on some things. First, clarity on the definition of common ownership for purposes of building portfolios, more clarity on the compliance requirements for smaller buildings, i.e. those buildings that are under 35,000 square feet and between 15 and 35 units. A request for the City of Boston to produce a mapping tool for applications for building portfolios that required an environmental justice review, a request to not require an update to the emission standard compliance plan when modifying an approved portfolio, and seeking more clarity on language related to benefits to environmental justice populations, opportunities for public comment during building portfolio applications, more clarity on how the City of Boston would verify building portfolio applications, and other minor revisions. Next slide, please. For individual compliance schedules, we'd had some comments requesting more clarity on whether baseline years can be formed based on fiscal years rather than calendar years. Also more clarity on how to create an ICS for a building portfolio that has multiple baseline years, clarity on interactions between blended emission standards and ICS. Also more information on appeals specifically related to modifications to approve ICS and other minor revisions. Next slide, please. Okay, so those were the general main themes that we found in comment letters, but all the comment letters are now publicly available on BERDO or boston.gov/BERDO-regulations. And for the review board members, you also have them available on your folders. And I will now go through some of the main revisions that we made to the language. Again, these revisions were presented to the APCC last week. Next slide, please. So this is the outline for regulations and policies related to building portfolios. And you can see the sections where there is any revision in red. And I will go through each of these sections and I will highlight specifically the main revisions in bold. Next slide, please. So on building portfolios, one of the main revisions was to revise the description of common ownership for purposes of building portfolios. And this was especially with respect to special entities, common control, and charitable organizations. We also clarified in requirements for building portfolios that an environmental justice review would be necessary for building portfolios that include campus district energy systems that use non-renewable or CO2 emitting fuels. And in the application process, one of the main changes was that we added a new application pathway. We are calling this pathway 0. To create a building portfolio for a single parcel that has multiple buildings that cumulatively meet the coverage thresholds of BERDO and that have the same owner. So reviewer members may remember that the buildings covered by BERDO are those that are 20,000 square feet or larger or 15 or more residential units. But there's also the cases of single parcels that have multiple buildings, and those smaller buildings collectively sum to 20,000 square feet or more, or 15 or more residential units. So we are clarifying that if that parcel with multiple buildings has the same owner, then that could be constitute a building portfolio and they would have to go through pathway 0. And we also had other minor revisions regarding timelines and opportunities for public comment during the application process. Next slide, please. For portfolios, we also clarified that the review board shall include standard conditions on the approval of any building portfolio. This was just a clarification between if the review board may or shall decide to do these standard conditions. And just for clarity, we clarified that they shall include these standard conditions. We had other minor revisions regarding timelines for modifications, and we clarified that if modifications to a building portfolio would trigger the need for an environmental justice review, where one was not required before, then owners shall submit the initial emission standards compliance plan within 2 years of the review board's approval of the modification. And just to clarify, this would be the case of, for example, a building portfolio that was first approved as a pathway 1 and did not have any environmental justice review requirements, then comes to the review board a few years after, adds a building that triggers that EJ review. So then we're clarifying, once you are required to do a review, you have 2 years to submit your first emission standard compliance plan. We also have some other revisions regarding timelines to notify the transfer of building portfolios and termination of building portfolios. Next slide, please. In the policy language, we also clarified that the Environment Department shall provide either a mapping tool for owners to use or instructions for preparing standard maps that are required for the environmental justice review. And we also revised the language to clarify that the distribution of benefits associated with BERDO compliance will be evaluated across buildings included in the building portfolio. And this refers again to the environmental justice review, where owners have to submit a compliance plan and progress report. We're just clarifying the scope is really the buildings that are included in that building portfolio and not other buildings. So we had other minor language revisions on benefits, the narratives, the content of updates and annual progress reports. And finally, revised language to clarify when the review board may decide to, oh, I got lost, sorry. Terminate versus amend a building portfolio. Next slide, please. So those were the main revisions for building portfolios, and I'm now gonna move on to individual compliance schedules. Next slide, please. This is again the outline of draft regulations and draft policy, and in red you can see the sections where there's any revisions of language, and I'll go through these sections again in the following slides. Next slide, please. So for individual compliance schedules, we had a few minor revisions similar to building portfolios on clarifying timelines, clarifying that building portfolios with multiple baseline years will use one single declining emission standard. Again, more clarifications on the interactions between blended emission standard and individual compliance schedules, and same regarding timelines for transfer of individual compliance schedules. Next slide, please. Again, revisions regarding termination timelines when the reviewer may decide to amend rather than terminate an ICS. And the main change is that in the policy language, we added a new section that is specified that the Environment Department shall provide guidance on how to generate an individual compliance schedule for a building portfolio with multiple baseline years. Next slide, please. So those were the language revisions regarding both building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, but I also wanted to highlight some next steps that the Environment Department is taking. So the Environment Department is currently developing draft standard forms to apply for building portfolios and ICS, and we will make those draft forms available for review and public comment as soon as possible. And the Environment Department is also working to develop an environmental justice mapping tool to be used for these building portfolio applications and the emission standard compliance plan. Next slide, please. And finally, before I end this section, we also wanted to clarify that Applications for building portfolios and ICS will be open after the regulations are adopted. So those applications are not open right now. And we have gotten multiple questions regarding whether the first deadline is this September. So given the timeline of the regulations development process, we do not anticipate that September 1st of this year will be the first deadline. The first deadline to apply would be September 1st of 2024. But of course, we encourage owners to apply earlier than that deadline after the regulations are adopted. Next slide, please. And I think that's all from my side.
Great. Thank you, Claudia and Diana, for providing updates. So we'll be starting out comments, discussion with the board. So I will ask if any board members have questions or comments. So starting to see if board member Boyd has joined us. If she has any questions.
I don't believe board member Boyd has joined us yet.
All right, moving on to board member Ellis.
Yes, thank you. First off, let me express appreciation for Pathway Zero and as well as the additional details surrounding the emission standard compliance plan. I do have two questions. First, am I interpreting that the APCC has opened up a second commenting period so that folks are able to compare the different pathways, meaning the building portfolios, the ICS, as well as the hardship compliance plan? Is that interpretation correct?
Yes, so I forgot to mention a few of the comments requested more time to evaluate building portfolios and ICS regulations and to be able to compare them to hardship compliance plans. So since we introduced preliminary proposals at the APCC in the last hearing, we extended the public comment and opened a second public comment so that people have an opportunity to comment on these building portfolio and ICS regulations at the same time that there's proposals for hardship compliance plans. That's also the reason to extend into 28 days.
Got it. Thank you. Now, regarding that 28 days, does the Environment Department foresee that you'll be able to have the draft forms ready in time before the close of the second commenting period that has been open?
I think the plan would be to have a separate comment period for the draft forms rather than try and put it into that 4-week period. We're aiming to move as soon as we can, but I don't think we have a set schedule for that yet.
Okay, not a problem. I look forward to seeing that. And also, I just want to express appreciation that the September 1st date has been clarified, that it's 2024 and not 2023. So I have no further questions. Thank you.
Yes, we are all happy that the deadline is in 2 weeks. Thank you, board member Ellis. Moving on to board member Jacobs. Any questions or comments?
No questions or comments at the moment.
Great. Moving on to board member Lattimore.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So I just want to make sure I understand too that the comments, the revisions that you went over, Claudia, are in response to all of those all those comments that came from those groups that you mentioned at the beginning, correct? And then I just wanted to ask if you could remind and clarify kind of how that, there's a slide in the first section that talked about standard conditions in parentheses, and what was that standard conditions issue, if you could remind us, and what was the response to that? I just want to make sure I understand that, because I didn't get a chance to look at all the responses in advance.
Sure. So yes, all of these revisions were in response to the comment letters that we got, in additional to feedback that we got in through APCC hearings, review board hearings, or community advisory group. And there's a complete response to comments from the staff that is available both in your folder and on the regulations website. And the comment regarding standard conditions is that people were confused whether those standard conditions, as we refer to in the regulations, are required for the review board to set for all building portfolios and ICS, or if the review board could decide, oh, maybe this person doesn't need the standard conditions. So just for the sake of clarity, we decided to revise that the review board shall include standard conditions on the approval of any building portfolio. And in addition, the review board has the ability to add special conditions for those that have environmental justice requirements.
So standard conditions apply across the board, but we could add special conditions. So there's no such thing as modifying standard conditions, meaning, you know, they're just baseline standard conditions. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Board Member Ledmore. Board Member O'Malley.
No questions at this time. I will read through all of the correspondence we've received and want to thank everyone. I know we've seen a lot of the same folks that will submit comments, and as you can see, it's having a positive effect on what these regulations end up being. I want to thank the Environment Department for hearing everyone out. I think we're seeing a better product as a result of it, and appreciate flexibility without sacrificing the important work that we're setting out to do here. So thanks for that. No questions at this time.
Great. And so yeah, I just had a quick question. One of the comments on building portfolios was on request to not require updates to the emission standard compliance plan when modifying an approved building portfolio. So I just wanted to ask if you could provide a little more clarity on that comment, and if were there any updates or changes to revisions made to the regulations in response to that comment.
Yes, so we mentioned it briefly in the summary, but you will be able to find in the policy language that we made some slight revisions to clarify the scope of the updates. So we still believe that if there's a modification for the building portfolio, it would be important for the review board to see that reflected in the owner's plans, emission standard compliance plans. But we specify the scope and timeline to make those revisions to make sure they're not burdensome. So it's not a full new compliance plan, just what are the modifications due to those additions, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. All right, now we will open the meeting to public comments. As a reminder, members of the public, to provide public comment, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via Zoom meeting platform. And if you're calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and send your questions to staff via email at BERDO@boston.gov. Again, as a reminder, we are limiting questions to 3 minutes to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak. We will also ask members of the public to introduce themselves and their neighborhood. And now we will wait to give members of the public the opportunity to provide comments. All right, so not hearing any comments from the public. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we staff can try to answer them in the chat, or we can come back to your question as we move through the agenda. Just give folks another couple of seconds to raise their hand or type in their questions if they have them. All right, hearing nothing. Are there any further discussion or questions from the board? All right, great. So we'll be moving on to the next agenda item. So staff will now present preliminary proposals on hardship compliance plan and equitable emission investment that were presented at the APCC last week.
Thank you. I'm gonna give the mic to Aladdin for hardship compliance plans, and I'll be back for the equitable emissions investment fund.
Great, thanks, Claudia.
Great, thank you. So as noted, these are preliminary proposals. So there will be multiple opportunities for public input. We have opened an informal public comment period that will run for 4 weeks. We are having a technical working session tomorrow, and then we will have draft regulations where we'll open at the APCC's discretion a formal public comment period. So again, these are our starting points. So as the next slide shows, just a reminder that hardship plans originate in the ordinance. They're one of several forms of flexibility for compliance. We've already talked tonight about building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. So hardship compliance plans are flexibility measures that owners may request, and they must be approved by the review board on a case-by-case basis. Owners experiencing a hardship complying with BERDO may seek relief such as alternative emissions reduction targets or timelines. Examples of potential causes for hardship that are provided in the ordinance include historic building designations, affordable housing refinancing timelines, and pre-existing long-term energy contracts without reopeners. So as the next slide, I just want to talk about kind of what is a hardship. So a hardship could exist if, despite using all available compliance mechanisms and flexibility measures provided by the ordinance, the unusual circumstances or characteristics of a building owner, building, or building portfolio means that compliance with BERDO would create an undue burden on a building owner or significantly interfere with or significantly increase the cost of providing critical services. So hardship should be evaluated on a near-term basis or considering locked-in circumstances that can't be changed in the near term. So for example, not having a plan to meet a 2050 target in 2024 is not a hardship because we need to think about systems and technologies and circumstances as they evolve over time. So we think hardships would be evaluated on a rolling basis. So in these next slides, I'll provide a little more detail on the components of hardship. So here you'll see we talk about what does undue burden mean. So we're suggesting an undue burden could exist if a building owner's total compliance costs would be significantly higher because of the unusual circumstances or characteristics of their owner, the building or building portfolio, should cause interruption in financial ability to operate, or cause such other significant effects that the review board determines should be mitigated in light of benefits provided by or greenhouse gas emissions avoided by the building or building portfolio. And examples of critical services include provision of life-saving services and affordable housing. So on the next slide, you'll see that we're broadly grouping circumstances and characteristics that could contribute to hardship into 4 categories. We recognize that many of these circumstances and characteristics could interact. The Environment Department would provide guidance regarding demonstrating these circumstances or characteristics. And then the next few slides, I'll just go through some examples of these circumstances or characteristics that could fall into each of these categories. So on the financial category, examples include bankruptcy of an owner during part or all of a compliance year, or a schedule of compliance costs that don't align with long-term schedules for capital expenditures that can't be changed or are beyond the control of the owner. So reflecting back to the ordinance, an example here could be affordable housing refinancing timelines. On the next slide, we look at some of the regulatory and contractual circumstances and characteristics that could contribute to a hardship. Again, this first one reflects language from the ordinance, long-term energy contracts that don't have reopeners that account for a significant portion of a building or portfolio's energy demand. We're looking at kind of delays in electric system interconnections or permits. And this wouldn't be a delay because you applied the day before your compliance was due. We're kind of trying to think what would be the reasonable time period after which a delay is outside an owner's control. We also are thinking about government regulations or accreditation or certification standards that affect the minimum energy use of a building. So in the next slide, just a brief overview of some of the technical or operational circumstances and characteristics that could lead to a hardship. There could be space constraints for significant compliance-related work. The equipment needed for significant compliance work might not be adequately demonstrated or available in the United States yet. We're also thinking about high process loads, high critical loads with high emissions that are currently challenging to decarbonize with readily accessible technologies. Again, this is another example where the circumstance that contributes to a hardship could change in 5 to 10 years as technologies change. On the next slide, our other category, we have 2 examples here. One is natural disasters, and the other is retaining discretion for the review board to designate other circumstances and characteristics that you believe could contribute to a hardship. And again, recognizing that these circumstances could interact. So briefly on eligibility, who could apply for a hardship compliance plan? This is open for buildings or building portfolios, and we're proposing that they should be in compliance with BERDO at the time of application, and that the review board should have discretion to waive some or all compliance obligations for past non-compliance with emission standards. And again, you can see we have a question mark on other, like all components of this proposal. We are seeking feedback if there should be other issues to address here. On the next slide, we briefly overview what relief for hardship could look like. So in the review board's discretion, relief for a hardship could take several forms. Examples include alternative schedules for complying with the emission standards in the ordinance. And just to flag here that these would need to be linear or better the way they would be with an individual compliance schedule. So that's what's different about this pathway. Another form of relief could be alternative emission standards other than those in the ordinance. Exemption of specified energy uses from a building owner's compliance obligations. Adjusted compliance obligations in light of third-party electrification barriers or delays. Additional compliance mechanisms, or other relief, that the review board deems appropriate on a case-by-case basis. And again, any relief could apply to some or all of an owner's compliance obligations, and it could be temporary or permanent in nature, or be granted with a condition to re-review every certain number of years to see if circumstances, technology, solutions, et cetera, have changed. On the next slide, you'll see we're asking for input on applications fees for hardship compliance plans, including whether there should be application fees for buildings, building portfolios, or requests for modifications to hardship compliance plans, and how we should calculate fees. And these are examples of factors that we could use one or combined. And then again, reserving the right for the review board at its discretion to waive or reduce application fees where it feels appropriate, particularly if applications are based on financial circumstances. On the next slide, you'll see we talk about timelines for applications for hardship compliance plans. And you'll see when we talk about timelines, these are longer generally than for building portfolios and individual compliance schedules, because we recognize they will probably be more complicated. So we do suggest that they be submitted on a rolling basis, generally speaking, at least 12 months before the first compliance year in which the hardship compliance plan would be effective. Now, recognizing we're a little short on time for the first compliance year of 2025 being the first year that buildings have to meet an emission standard, the requirement be 6 months in advance in 2024. So July 1st of next year would be the deadline for an application for a hardship compliance plan to be effective in 2025. We'd welcome people to submit applications more than a year in advance of an anticipated hardship, but would reserve the right for the review board to prioritize review of applications based on the year that the hardship would begin. On the next slide, we briefly outline ideas for what should be in the application for a hardship compliance plan. What kind of information should a building owner bring to the review board? So you'll see we suggested narratives and supporting material about the circumstances and characteristics that contribute to a hardship, what the building owner has done about considering and using all other compliance mechanisms and flexibility measures that are authorized by the ordinance, a description of prior significant emissions reduction efforts or work on high energy systems or loads in the building or portfolio, evaluation of opportunities and for financial support for compliance related work at a building. So thinking about energy audits, mass save, government programs. If siting constraints are a concern, is there any opportunity to use off-site property for compliance mechanisms? And then we would ask applicants to tell us what relief, or the review board, what relief they are seeking and conditions on proposed alternative compliance that would advance the BERDO objectives. So for example, what would there be their proposals to address tenant protections, rent stabilization, workforce development, and other priorities identified in the ordinance. On the next slide, you'll see the conditions on relief for hardship. As we were discussing before, there would be a combination of standard conditions that would apply to all relief. These would generally be things like staying in compliance with BERDO and the hardship compliance plan, perhaps rights to, inspect buildings, audit records as appropriate, And then special conditions at the discretion of the review board on a case-by-case basis. And these could include conditions related to the proposal of a building owner to advance priorities identified in the BERDO ordinance. You could have conditions related to employment plans, energy cost and benefit sharing, housing stabilization measures, efforts like that. On the next slide, we're proposing that once somebody submits an application, the Environment Department would have 45 days to determine if the application is complete. Within 45 days of that determination, the review board should hold a public hearing on the application. We do not include a deadline for when the review board would have to make a decision so that there is ability to have more than one public hearing if the review board deems appropriate. And then there's this kind of standard that once the decision is made, a copy shall be sent to the building owner. We'd ask them to record it and send a copy of that recording or evidence of that recording back to the review board, and then an opportunity to appeal a decision to the APCC. On the next slide, we talk about modifications of hardship compliance plans. So including changes to the underlying building portfolio, that these modifications need to be approved by the review board is the proposal. So you can see, and if a building is removed from a hardship compliance plan, the proposal would become subject to the emission standards in the ordinance, or if it's part of a building portfolio, the blended emission standard for that building portfolio. If there's a hardship compliance plan for a building portfolio, we recommend reevaluating the hardship compliance plan if a building's removed from the building portfolio. If an owner wanted to add an existing building to a building portfolio that has a hardship compliance plan, you need we're proposing that there be approval from the review board to decide if that building could be added and whether the hardship compliance plan needs to be adjusted. We are proposing that newly constructed buildings may not be added to a hardship compliance plan. And then on our last slide, sorry, I know it's a lot of information quickly, is a section on termination. That as always, owners would have the right to terminate an approved hardship compliance plan with notice to the review board. And that a hardship compliance plan for a building portfolio would be automatically terminated if the underlying building portfolio is terminated, and that the review board may initiate a proceeding to terminate a hardship compliance plan. So again, that's where we are with these preliminary proposals. As I mentioned, we have an informal public comment period now for feedback. There's the technical session tomorrow, and then we'll have draft regulations for formal feedback. With that, I'll turn it back to Claudia to report on one more topic, and then we'll come back for questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm gonna quickly move on to the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. Next slide, please. So we have introduced this topic before to this review board, but as a reminder, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund is also a fund created by the ordinance that will collect all alternative compliance payments or ACPs and penalties made to BERDO and invest them in local building carbon abatement projects. This means that all projects that are funded by this fund have to have an emissions reduction component and be related to buildings specifically. Fund expenditures shall prioritize projects that benefit environmental justice communities, and the review board is responsible for evaluating project proposals, making expenditure recommendations, and setting conditions for expenditure. Next slide, please. Our first set of proposals are related to eligibility criteria. We are proposing that any building owner or resident located in the city of Boston or entity acting on their behalf should be eligible to receive funding. We're also proposing that the review board shall hold at least one application cycle per year, and that applicants must submit project proposals for local building carbon abatement projects and present a narrative of how the project would provide benefits to environmental justice populations and or advance the purposes of the ordinance. Next slide, please. We also have created a set of preliminary project evaluation criteria that the review board could use to evaluate project proposals. This is the set of criteria, and I'm going to explain each of them in the next slide. Next slide, please. So the first one is greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This is shaded in gray because all of the projects must have an emissions reduction component, but we are proposing that the review board may consider the expected timing and scale of the emissions reductions when comparing proposed projects. The next criterion is benefits to environmental justice populations. This would mean whether projects are located in or directly benefit environmental justice populations. The next one is benefits to affordable housing and tenant protections. This could be whether projects directly benefit low-income residents and residents of affordable housing, including both deed-restricted residential buildings and naturally occurring affordable housing, and whether projects include anti-displacement measures such as rent stabilization, rent assistance, and or relocation assistance. The next criterion is benefits to labor and workforce development. This could be whether projects include benefits to local contractors, cooperative contractors, and minority women and disadvantaged business enterprises, as well as whether they promote equitable workforce development. The next criterion is improvements to outdoor air quality. So whether projects would result in the reduction of local air pollutants, including but not limited to carbon monoxide, lead, ground level ozone, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. We also have improvements to indoor air quality and occupant quality of life. Here we have whether projects would result in improvements in indoor air quality, thermal comfort, and or reduce energy bills for occupants. We also have climate resilience benefits, so whether projects include measures for heat or energy resilience, coastal resilience, stormwater flooding, or other hazards. And finally, geographic diversity, so the distribution of funded projects across Boston neighborhoods over time. Next slide, please. We also had other preliminary proposals. We are proposing that the review board may decide to dedicate any given application cycle to specific types of benefits or types of applicants that align with the goals of the fund and the ordinance. We're suggesting that the review board may prioritize projects that meet multiple evaluation criteria. And if there are insufficient qualified proposals, funds may be held over to the next application cycle, provided, however, that starting in 2026, new monies might not sit in the fund for more than 5 years. Next slide, please. We also have similar proposals related to conditions. So for all cases, there could be standard conditions related to ongoing compliance with BERDO, the timeline of project completion, reporting responsibilities, or repayment in case of lack of compliance, as well as special conditions that the review board could add at their discretion on a case-by-case basis, related to providing benefits to environmental justice populations or advancing the purposes of the ordinance. And these special conditions would be discussed at a public hearing. Next slide, please. And that was all from my side. Looking forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Aladine and Claudia. Now we'll be going to the board for any comments and questions. Board Member Ellis.
Forgive me, I might not get through all my questions, so I might have to do a second round. So, but just to start off with some of the notes and questions that I have regarding the hardship compliance plan and what conditions should be considered. I heard Aladdin asked about other, and I can't help but think about the pandemic that we just had. And so thinking a pandemic or even an epidemic, I think should be added as a condition, just so it might be something that is like well known or expected, but I'm just saying that I think that language should just be included given the reality that we're facing. So that's just the first part that came across for me. The first question I have really is about the rationale or the thoughts behind the fee for the hardship compliance plan. Can you provide us some context about how you are intending for us to use that, or why is there a fee? Like I that's my first question. I'm wondering a little bit more about that.
Yep. So one possible consideration is we are exploring opportunities for the review board to hire, when needed, its own like expert consultant to help with the review and decision of an application. So this is a potential funding source for that. But we are open to feedback of whether application fees make sense in this context. We do recognize that probably hardship compliance plans would be used less frequently than building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. But again, welcome feedback on whether it makes sense, how to set it, and what to do with the funds or alternative ways of funding use of experts.
Okay, thank you for that context. And I feel like I'm sitting on the edge of my seats because I'm wondering if the healthcare industry would probably be the first to sort of submit hardship compliance plan, given the nature of what they have going on there. In addition, I do appreciate the flexibility that the city has considered for those that have financial constraints, because it kind of it's a little weird for me to have a fee for financial constraints. So I'm just wondering now that if we don't see a need to use those funds, where would those funds go? Would they just sit in the city's office? Would it go into the equitable emissions fund? So that's the other thought that I'm wondering. If we don't use it for the purpose or example that you just provided, where could it go?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, and that is something we will work on responding to. And I would invite feedback from others on as well, where it should go.
If it's not used, put it in the equitable emission fund. That's what I think, but I will defer to some of the other members of the board. Now, there was one more part under the hardship compliance plan where I just wanted to see clarity, because earlier we were talking about building portfolios and that pathway 0 that had mentioned collectively taking together all buildings that are a part of one parcel. Now, how does the I believe the line was for hardship compliant plan for building portfolios, the hardship compliant plan will be evaluated if the building is removed from the building portfolio. I guess I'm wondering, how does that work together?
Yeah, and I think just to be clear on the pathway 0, that it's a parcel. It wouldn't be a large parcel that has multiple buildings that are subject to BERDO on their own, like a traditional campus. This would be a parcel where none of the buildings on their own would be subject to BERDO. It's because of their collective size and being on a single parcel. So if that one parcel were to have a hardship compliance plan and then remove a building, like sell one of those buildings from the parcel, like I feel like that's its own special category that we'll have to think about, because then there's a question of, are they still subject to BERDO at all, because they may have collectively fallen below the threshold for being in. I think with your question though about more generally, if you're talking about changes to a building portfolio that are subject to a hardship compliance plan, we do want feedback on this, because we appreciate the feedback we've heard that building portfolios can change over time, that people can add buildings in and out. And we want to see if there's a way of allowing that fluidity to stay while having a hardship compliance plan. But thinking about that doesn't necessarily automatically mean that the revised building portfolio has all the benefits of the hardship compliance plan. Because if you take a building in or take one out that significantly changes the circumstances that led to the hardship, we might want to reevaluate. So I think the question is, what types of additions and removals to a building portfolio would require review of the hardship compliance plan? What are some kind of standards we should look at for how modifying one affects the other? I know it doesn't answer your question, but I hope it addresses the issues we're thinking about.
Yes. And I think I appreciate you bringing that up. That's something that I feel like I'm going to have to think about, given my personal background. But I'll provide feedback on an offhand call if necessary, if I come up with a particular thought. I'm going to shift gears really quickly to the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. I'm wondering if there are any potential concerns of double dipping, and what I mean by that is that the mayor's office or the city council might have particular plans going on to also address the issue of climate change. And so one that just popped in my mind is the urban forest plan. And in that particular case, I am wondering, how is the environment department sort of keeping up with the different types of initiatives and plans, and can provide recommendations to the board about thoughts that we may have. So for example, if we're thinking, oh, let's add more trees, and there's already a plan that is financing that particular initiative. I guess that's just a thought. I haven't really fleshed out my question yet because it was just something that come up a second ago while I was listening to Claudia's presentation. If there's any comments, I would love to hear them, but I think I still need to flesh out my question.
I think maybe I can start and then turn it to Claudia, but I think one piece that we didn't really present in detail is what an application for use of the funds would look like. And I think that is a piece that we could try to address in part through applications to ask, what other funding sources do you have for a project, including other city or state programs? And, sometimes we could have a guidance document that has examples. It might not necessarily always be up to date, but it would be a starting point for that discussion to think about. And I think an issue that we'd welcome feedback on and for the review board to consider is whether an application for funding should be the only funding that a project needs. Is layering funding okay to do if a project, can't go ahead without some additional financing? But I think that could be addressed in part through an application question. But again, welcome more on feedback on that as well. It's a great point.
Sorry, trying to find the mute button. I have no further questions or comments at this time.
Great, thank you, Board Member Ellis. Moving on to Board Member Jacobs. Any questions or comments?
No questions or comments.
Great, thank you. Board Member Lattimore.
Yeah, excuse me, yes. I wonder if the city has any sense of how many people might, in terms of the definition of undue burden, of how many, any sense of how many owners would qualify under that definition, or would have their buildings fall under that definition.
I do not.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suspect, perhaps as we get more reporting data, that's something that we could try to evaluate, but it's, again, we see where people are. We don't necessarily get behind the scenes stories from the data that we have. But it is an interesting question for us to keep thinking about sources of information. And again, welcome suggestions about how to collect that information.
Thank you. And there was something, I thought I saw something in them looking at my notes or heard something or read something in as you were speaking about, is it the case that the review board would have the ability to waive non-compliance issues in order for someone to be eligible?
So what we were suggesting is that eligibility to apply means that up until that point, a building or portfolio should have been in compliance with reporting obligations and any emission standard obligations that had existed up to that point. We had suggested the ability to waive fees or coming up to date with obligations about emission compliance, emission standards requirements. So we hadn't suggested waiving for reporting obligations, but again, we're open to feedback on what that should entail, but we were focused on if they hadn't complied with an emissions standard, was there a reason that that fee and any kind of catching up payment should be waived?
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I wondered then, and speaking as a owner of affordable housing or a developer, not owner of affordable housing, we're tracking obviously our compliance, and for the most part, we are compliant. There are some, I think a couple of buildings where we need to do some work. But I did note a note from our management company that manages our properties that the timing, just curious about that they have recently heard from the city about some additional questions related to their reporting, that where they thought they were compliant, but then the city apparently has some additional questions, may be looking at things a bit differently. So I'm just wondering about how is the city going to kind of notify, or how is the city keeping notifying owners of their compliance or non-compliance status, and the timing of the city, or how that aligns with the timing for anyone kind of lining themselves up for for either just what the timing is for that.
Yeah. So I think the timing piece is a good point, and one that we should probably address when we get to the section on enforcement of the regulations in particular. I know in many programs, if you submit a complete application or complete set of reporting data by the due date, and then there's back and forth because of, technical questions, not because of an, significant error like fault on the applicant's side or the reporter's side, that would not count towards being late. And I think we would look to do something similar, but again, we'll be open to feedback there. And to date, the city does send out letters to building owners, letting them know kind of their status and where they are in reporting if they're behind on reporting. So we are trying to keep people informed of that.
Thank you. And just a couple other quick questions. In terms of the hardship compliance application, and I think you went over some of the type of questions. I think that was the one that you went over that might be in that application, but do you have a sense of timing of availability of the hardship compliance applications?
So that will be a little further off because we'll want to
Mhm.
finish the regulations, but that will be some of the discussion we have hopefully at the technical session tomorrow. And it's an issue we're talking about with the technical consultant is what type of information should a building owner supply if they're asking for a technical, if there's a certain technical circumstances that lead to hardship. So that is something we're still kind of creating the information on, and that would go into the application form. Obviously, we'd strive for as soon as possible, as we do with everything.
Mhm. No,
Yep.
I understand. It's a lot. It's a lot to do for sure.
Yep.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep.
I have no other questions.
Great, thank you, Board Member Lattimore. Board Member O'Malley.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to tick through mine, but I'll start by saying when I saw the deck for today's meeting was 65 pages, I was a little nervous. So kudos to the team for plowing right through it. We're nearly there. First thing on the HCP, thank you for noting the delays in the electric system interconnection. I feel like that's something we have to watch, be mindful of. It's a legitimate concern. I also don't want every building to use it as a crutch. So it's just something I'm glad it was raised. It's something we should focus on. So thank you for that. I fully support having eligibility for the HCP, provided that someone is in compliance with the ordinance as it exists. I think that's a baseline. That's something everyone can do. I know we've got a good compliance percentage in terms of buildings. Those that aren't, I would urge the Environment Department to maybe notify those who aren't in compliance to say, the only way that you could qualify for an HCP is to be in compliance. And what that means is simply just making sure they share the data. Secondly, I'm glad that Board Member Ellis brought up the application fees. I'm not sold on it. One thing when we were passing this bill is critics were saying this was seen as a money grab. So I don't want to give credibility to that notion. As I've often said, I hope and I've said on this board, I hope we collect zero in ACPs because everyone's fully compliant with the ordinance. Having said that, it does make sense to have some sort of a bar to fill out an application fee. So I would say two things. One, it shouldn't be too onerous. It probably should be associated with the square footage or with the size or with the portfolio that the developer may have. And I would just ask, because I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't know if any folks here do. I'm not sure that we could earmark any application fees for the Equitable Investment Fund. It might by statute have to go to the general fund for application fees. So I don't know the answer to that. If anyone does, please feel free to educate me. Otherwise, we might need clarity from the Corporation Counsel's office on that. So I guess that's a question. My second question is, can you give me an example of a scenario where the board would be able to initiate termination of an HCP? That was, I think, the last bullet point. And I'm just trying to sort of, I think we should, I've been, loudly saying the board should have a lot of leeway here, but I'm just curious what prompted that bullet point in them.
Yep. And again, we welcome feedback on that question, but we were thinking in part the model that we have for building portfolios, where if an owner of a portfolio is not complying with any conditions for the portfolio, such as if they have an EJ plan, distributing benefits, that there could be something similar in the hardship compliance plan, because we envision most decisions would have some form of compliance still required for a building or building portfolio. And so if a owner is not meeting the conditions of their hardship compliance plan, over several years, we could think about what the time period and standards would be, but there might be a point at which the review board would want to initiate a review for termination.
No, and again, I'm not saying I'm against the idea. I was just
Yep.
curious. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Relative to the Equitable Investment Fund, funds may not sit for more than 5 years. I don't anticipate many funds will, but I'm curious, is that sort of legal boilerplate language that's included? Is that, I don't believe that was in the ordinance, but is that something that's been fleshed out in the regulations?
It is at this point a proposal.
Okay.
It's not based on the ordinance exactly. Yeah.
In what I'm just curious what the sort of rationale is behind that. Is that something that other funds would have just to make sure money gets moved?
I think it is just to make sure that there's some strange circumstance where projects were not approved over a multi-year period. Was the goal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last thing I would say is, I like the idea of having, as we develop the application, sort of not differentiating, but some of our data collection should include whether or not this would be a standalone funding, whether there's private, whether there's other state cities. So I forget who brought that point up, but that was a very good one, that we should do that. And we should also allow for maximum flexibility of the board. I think it's under F or under G, when we've sort of lay out what the Equitable Investment Fund can use for, we specifically added a bullet point that says any environmental initiative, and that was done to give the board maximum flexibility. I think we know, and it's obviously important, and we have an opportunity to make a really profound impact through this, but we also want to make sure that we don't needlessly limit ourselves. So I think this is a really good, some good work, and appreciate again the work of everybody involved. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you, Board Member O'Malley. Yeah, I just want to thank staff for putting together some great preliminary language for these regulations. Other board members' questions have definitely got me my gears turning, but I don't really have any coherent questions at this time, so I will keep us moving. So now we'll open public comment up to open comments to the public. So again, raise your hand if you'd like to make any comments, or type your questions into the chat. And if you are on the phone, please raise your hand by pressing *9, or send your questions to BERDO Review Board at boston.gov. So we'll give members of the public an opportunity to ask questions. Great. So not hearing any questions. Again, feel free to type any of your questions or comments into the chat. And if you have any questions. Going back to the board, if there's any further questions or discussion, I see that Board Member Ellis has his hand up. Board Member Ellis.
Yes, thank you, Acting Chair Palmer Dunning. I just wanted to jump back to the conversation that was happening with Board Member Lattimore in the city about sending out compliance notes. And this is just a recommendation, because I get the sense that there are some folks that may not even understand where they're at in terms of meeting the overall ordinance itself in terms of compliance. I'm wondering if it's even possible for the city to include in their notice to building owners what their emission standard is, based on the calculations that you're seeing when they submit their building size data as well as their energy data. It can just give them a sense of like knowing, I'm at a 6.5, kilograms per square feet and so on, kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square feet. So I'm just wondering if that's something that the city could consider adding to their compliance note in the future.
Yeah. At a high level, because I'm not the technical person, I'll say it is, of course, complicated because there's a lot of options building owners can kind of elect into, but we are working on a tool to do something like that. So yeah, thank you. We do appreciate that feedback, and hopefully we'll have something.
Okay, thank you, Aladdin. And the other comment that I just wanted to provide, I do support Board Member O'Malley's comment about if we are to employ a fee for the hardship compliance plan, I would recommend going based on square footage, just to apply one aspect. If it's not square footage, then one flat rate. But I do really think that it's worth considering if the money is not allowed to go into the equitable emission fund and to go to, forgive me, I believe you said like general funding or general counsel. I'm not familiar with that terminology. I'm just wondering, do we give them the money back? You know, I guess I'm just trying to consider what are the options. So it's not a money-making scheme that we're trying out here. So
Yeah, I appreciate that feedback, and we will look into that question of what the options are. We're looking at, other bodies that are able to take application fees and use them for consultants and to see if we have similar ability. So we can come back to you after we've done more research on that.
thank you. No further questions or comments.
Great, thank you, Board Member Ellis. Just a quick time check. I know we have a hard stop at 6, so I want to give Board Member Lattimore a moment to ask your question before we move on to the next agenda item. Oh, you're muted.
It wasn't really a question. I just wanted, well, maybe it is, want to make sure I understand the issue that was originally raised by Board Member Ellis and then spoken to by Board Member O'Malley about accessing other funding and the impact of other, Board Member Ellis mentioned about the tree issue, and and I'm not sure if I got that connection to this, but I definitely want to make sure that we are allowing for, I'm speaking as an affordable housing developer, for the layering of different city and other sources to comply, and not seeing that as an issue as we go through it. It's especially for certain populations that are doing public good like affordable housing. I think that's important. I mean, we, for example, just got I think $4,000 from the city to do some assessments, of how to decarbonize our buildings. It's actually going to take to do those kind of technical assessments. I hope you can hear me. It says my internet is unstable. But I just want to make sure that just, because we're getting access to different pots of funding to do this work or to try to do this work, that doesn't interfere with the kind of either looking at hardship compliance plans or looking at equitable emissions fund access. So I'm sure I'll try to make sure that I make comments to that extent also during the comment period. But I just want to, I'm not sure if I'm following, if I'm being correct in interpreting what Board Member Ellis said, and but that's just something I wanted to raise.
I can provide a quick comment, just for the sake of time. I mainly was bringing up the aspect of layering, particularly because if we don't have a large pot of funding to work with, that may become a concern if we're layering. But I am not against layering, but I will see how this develops over time. And to high level, I'm aligned with you. I'm more so concerned that if we don't have a large enough pool to pull from, making sure that we have building owners recognize that there are other options available for them beyond the equitable emissions investment fund.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that is part of the reason why, in my opinion, we need to prioritize, those that are kind of not only need the money, but have other higher, affordable housing and that type of things, going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Board Member Lattimore and Board Member Ellis. So before we move on to the next agenda, I just want to check with staff to see if we have enough time for our hard stop to get through the reporting and implementation updates as well as the administrative updates, or should we propose putting one of those during the next meeting?
Yes, if the board is amenable, we can defer Aiden's reporting update to the following meeting. Given I think we have a hard stop, and I think if Board Member O'Malley leaves, we lose quorum. So if that's okay to the board, we can defer to the next meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this. I didn't recognize I'd be in the quorum on.
okay.
We'd have close to quorum. So as long as we, if we go through it quickly, because I know there's a lot of information, you know, if it's 6:05, I can extend it a little bit. I just probably couldn't go much beyond that.
Okay, sounds good. No, it's okay. I think things came up today. I'm glad we were able to still meet. In that case, should I move on to the next
Yep,
slide?
great. Thanks for your flexibility, Board Member O'Malley. So we'll be switching gears to reporting and implementation updates from Aiden. So I'll hand it over.
Oh, sorry. Actually, it's quickly proposed next steps and then reporting updates. This always catches us by surprise. So very quickly, I'll just review proposed next steps. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a second comment period open for building portfolios and individual compliance schedules. That comment period is open until Friday, September 15th at 12 p.m. And the BERDO team will then read and summarize these comments, prepare revisions for a special APCC hearing in late September. Similarly, for hardship compliance plans and the fund, we currently have an informal comment period open until Friday, September 15th at 12 p.m. And then similarly, we'll receive those comments and prepare draft regulations to present at a special APCC hearing in late September, and fines and enforcement timeline to be determined. And then this is just a visual representation that we update as we go along. And now I will hand it over to Aiden.
Okay, thank you, Diana. You can go to the next slide. All right, so I'll be brief. You know, the reporting deadline for 2022 data reporting was originally on May 15th. But for buildings with a 3-month extension, that was extended out to August 15th. So we're a few days past it at this point. The BERDO team staff has been busy, following up with owners that are, still just trying to get across the finish line this year. So we will, detail the reporting compliance numbers during the next review board meeting. So, with that, we'll provide a summary of the number of buildings that are fully in compliance for the year, as well as those that are still in progress or have not yet started their BERDO reporting at all. We also aim to show the compliance rate, not just by the number of buildings, but by square footage, which I think was a suggestion of the review board during a previous meeting. Non-compliant buildings tend to skew towards the smaller buildings. So having a compliance rate that's based on the total square footage of BERDO covered buildings could provide perhaps a more well-rounded understanding of how BERDO is progressing. And beyond that, I just note that in addition to working with owners to kind of get them across the finish line, we will be sending out emails and letters detailing non-compliance within the next few weeks. And that should be it from my end.
Great, thanks, Aiden. Do we have any quick questions from the board? Yep, Board Member Ledmore.
Just curious about past rates of compliance versus non-compliance since the ordinance was initially. Can you just give a general take on that?
So how I wasn't with the team prior to last year, so I don't really have a great understanding of the overall compliance rate. Prior to BERDO 2.0, I think for reporting compliance, we're probably around 80% compliant, but I'm only speaking based on experience and what I've seen with past numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
And those were building owners that had been reporting to BERDO for a number of years. So just to provide a bit of context, our with BERDO 2.0, we brought in quite a lot more smaller buildings, and we're still working to kind of get their compliance rate up to that same level.
Thank you.
Board Member Ellis.
Very quickly, Aiden. And if it's not possible by next meeting, it's fine. I am particularly interested in compliance based on primary building type. So percentages across that, because it might help begin to get at that story about who might be experiencing hardship in the future. So if you could include that in your presentation, I would appreciate that.
That should be doable. Yeah, we'll work to pull those numbers together.
Great, thank you, Board Member Ellis. Board Member Jacobs, any questions?
No questions.
Board Member O'Malley.
None, thank you, Aiden.
And I have no questions as well. Almost at the finish line. Now we'll pass it to Diana to provide some additional administrative updates.
Yes, so just super quickly, our next meeting would have been September 4th, but it's Labor Day. So as a board, we've opted to move the meeting to September 11th, and we'll just have one meeting for the month of September. So instead of 2 weeks, we'll see each other in 3 weeks.
Great, thank you, Dinah. All right, so it seems like we are at the end of the agenda and we have 2 minutes left. So we'll be able to give 2 minutes back to Board Member O'Malley. All right. All right, I'd like to, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
Great, well, I think we'll go down roll call. Thank you. Board Member Ellis.
Aye.
Board Member Lattimore.
Aye.
Board Member Jacobs.
Aye.
Board Member O'Malley.
Aye.
And the ayes for me as well. So thank you, everybody. So the motion passes and this meeting will adjourn at 5:59. So thank you, everybody, for joining us at our board meeting, our BERDO board meeting this week. And I look forward to connecting with everybody at the next meeting.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all, thanks.